Winter dusk had settled like a slow bleed over the frontier station, the air sharp enough to bite through wool and skin alike. Steam hissed from the last freight train as it groaned away, the plume hanging above the platform like the breath of something dying. The whistle wailed once, thin and lonely, before melting into the endless plains. When the sound faded, so did the movement, until only one figure remained on the bench, a heavy woman hunched against the cold, one boot gone, the hem of her skirt ragged, a thin thread of blood trailing from her ankle to stain the snow beneath her feet. Her breath came shallow and fast, the sound barely more than a whisper in the frozen air. The station master caught her in his glance and immediately looked elsewhere, pulling his collar higher, as if her presence was a wind to be shut out. Two cowhands leaned against a post, their faces split with low chuckles that carried just far enough for her to hear. Across the platform, a saloon girl paused long enough to mutter, "Don't touch trouble," before stepping into the warmth of the waiting room. The station itself was a skeleton of wood and frost, its paint worn away, its windows clouded with the breath of strangers now gone. Beyond it, the town crouched in the dim light, frozen dirt streets, facades that leaned on one another like old drunks, the blackened ribs of a mill that had burned out 2 winters ago. The wind came in brief, mean gusts, carrying grit that scratched the skin and fine ash that caught in the corners of the eyes. Everything seemed muted, stripped of color, except for that small, startling red against the white at the woman's feet. She shifted, the movement slow, her fingers stiff and clumsy inside fingerless gloves. The canvas bag on her lap was tied shut with a length of rope, and she gripped it so tight the knuckles swelled pale. Her clothes hung wrong, jacket too small at the shoulders, skirt bunched awkwardly as though it had once belonged to someone taller and thinner. She leaned forward, bracing her hands on the bench, and tried to stand. The bad ankle betrayed her instantly, and she dropped back down, jaw tight, eyes narrowed against the pain. For a moment she stared at the ground as though considering whether it was worth trying again. The creak of wagon wheels came from the far end of the platform, and a tall man stepped down from the bed, brushing coal dust from his gloves. He wore a long, military coat gone threadbare at the seams, the brass buttons dulled to a shadow of their shine. His shoulders were broad, but there was a weight in his posture that came from more than work. His eyes, gray, almost colorless, carried winters the land hadn't seen in years. People in town knew him, though not well, a widower for 3 years, his only child buried the year after. He spoke little, drank even less, and kept to the work that kept him alive. He caught sight of her while swinging a burlap sack of coal to the platform. His gaze lingered for a heartbeat too long, but he didn't move toward her. Instead, he shifted the weight of the sack onto the ground, fished a pipe from his pocket, and leaned his back against the station wall. The match flared briefly, casting his face into sharp relief before the small flame died into the bowl of the pipe. He exhaled slow streams of smoke into the frozen air, watching as others passed her without pause. The woman's head lifted slightly when the station clerk emerged from the office. She rose halfway, wincing, and asked him something, her voice soft, but the words carried just enough for the man against the wall to hear. "Could I trouble you for water?" The clerk's answer was quick, sharp in its dismissal. "Kitchen's closed." No apology, no explanation. He kept walking, his boots crunching hard in the snow. The moment hung there, brittle as ice. She stood for a second longer, her mouth working as if she had more to say. Then she sat back down slowly. Her gaze dropped to the ground again, not in defeat, but in an effort to hide whatever her eyes might have given away. The widower watched the exchange, smoke curling from between his fingers. He could see the way her hands clenched tighter around the rope of her bag, the faint tremor in her jaw as she swallowed what she'd been given. He looked away, studying the outline of the burned mill in the distance, and then toward the road where his wagon waited. His boots shifted in the snow, but he didn't step forward. The cowhands had gone now, their laughter replaced by the faint creak of the saloon door swinging shut. The wind came again, lifting the fringe of her skirt, exposing the swollen ankle and the rough, filthy binding around it. She pulled the cloth back down quickly, almost fiercely, as if the sight of it might be used against her. He took another draw from his pipe, the ember glowing in the gathering dark. and for a long while neither of them moved. The train was long gone. The town was shrinking further into itself. Somewhere down the street a door slammed, and the echo ran thin through the cold air. She glanced up once, her eyes flicking toward him as if she'd only just noticed he was there. There was no plea in them, no invitation, just the flat, guarded look of someone who'd stopped expecting help but still measured the distance to the nearest threat. The widower shifted his weight, knocked the ashes from his pipe into the snow, and slid it into his coat pocket. His gaze traveled once more over her, pausing at the way she sat, a stubborn, almost defiant stillness, despite the cold seeping into her bones. He turned slightly toward the road, his breath pale in the fading light. But he didn't walk away. The platform had emptied to nothing but the sound of wind pushing grit along the boards. He stayed where he was until the last of the townsfolk melted into doorways and side streets. Only then did he push away from the wall, slip his pipe into his coat pocket, and walk toward her. She straightened, her fingers tightening around the rope that bound her bag. But he didn't stop. Without asking, he took the bag from her lap, its weight nearly nothing in his hand. He looked at her once, just long enough for a small nod toward the street, and then turned as if the matter was settled. For a long moment she didn't move. Distrust flickered plainly in her eyes, but the cold was sharper than pride, and she pushed herself up from the bench. The limp was worse than he'd guessed, each step pulling at her balance. She followed, her breaths quick and shallow, each one clouding the air between them. They passed the saloon, its yellow lamplight spilling out onto the snow. A knot of men leaned against the railing, watching. One spat into the drift, smirking. "Guess he's got low standards now," he said, loud enough to carry. The words found her and burned deeper than the cold. She dropped her gaze to the snow, cheeks flushing, while he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his stride steady and unbroken. The buildings thinned as they left the main street behind. The snow deepened, clinging to the edges of his boots, muffling the sound of their steps. Houses grew farther apart, their windows dim behind frost and curtains. A dog barked once in the distance, then fell silent. The world beyond the town seemed stripped bare, the horizon pale and endless. She limped harder now, wincing with every few steps. He noticed and let his own pace ease, not enough to draw attention to it, but enough that she didn't have to struggle to keep up. At one point he glanced at her, then extended his arm in a silent offer. She shook her head quickly, as if the acceptance would cost more than she could pay. In the faint light, the dull gleam of a ring caught his eye, still on his finger, worn thin from years and weather. It shifted loosely when his hand moved, the gold a memory rather than a promise. He didn't touch it, didn't think about it long, but the weight of it stayed with him. The bag in his hand was so light it might have been empty. A shirt or two, perhaps, and the edge of a blanket that had seen better years. Still, he could see the way she'd gripped it earlier, like a tether to the last part of herself she trusted. He didn't ask what was inside. They came to the creek, its surface frozen over but slick with a glaze of wind-polished ice. He stepped onto it first, testing the footing. She followed, determined not to take his hand, but halfway across her boot slid, and she pitched forward. His arm was around her before she could fall, his grip firm and certain. This time she didn't pull away. He kept hold of her until they reached the far bank, and even then he let the moment break on its own rather than release her too soon. The cabin appeared after another quarter-mile, crouched at the base of a low ridge, its walls dark with age and storms. The roof line sagged slightly under the snow, but smoke curled from the chimney in a thin, steady line. A fence ran half-buried along one side, the gate hanging slightly open. He pushed through the drift to the door and swung it wide, without ceremony. Warmth rolled out immediately, the dry heat of a wood stove, rich with the scent of pine and old coffee. He stepped aside, the gesture as unspoken as everything else he'd done, and she crossed the threshold as though testing a dream for its edges. Inside, the light came from a single oil lamp on the table, its flame licking gently at the glass. Shadows lay soft against the walls, broken by the steady orange glow from the stove. The space was small but orderly. A bed neatly made in the corner, a shelf of tins and jars, a worn chair pulled near the fire. He set her bag on the floor beside the wall and moved to the stove, checking the fire with a practiced glance. The wood popped softly, sending a flare of warmth across the room. She stood near the door, letting the heat touch her in slow waves, her shoulders lowering by degrees. The frost on her skirt began to melt, darkening the fabric. He poured coffee into a dented tin cup and set it on the table without a word. She looked at it for a moment before stepping forward, wrapping both hands around the metal as if she might never set it down again. Steam rose into her face, fogging her lashes. The wind rattled faintly at the shutters, but inside the world had gone quiet. Neither spoke. He took the chair by the stove, leaning forward to feed the fire, while she sat at the table, the cup close to her lips. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the air was heavy with wood smoke and something else, something not yet named but settling in, slow as the heat in her bones. She kept close to the stove, one hand extended toward the heat, as though it might vanish if she let go. The air inside was thick with wood smoke and the faint scent of coffee ground simmering in the pot. Her gaze moved over the room in quick, furtive glances. The worn chair pulled up to the fire, the neat row of jars along a shelf, the rifle leaning by the door. Each detail seemed something she had to account for, like a gambler memorizing a table before she placed her bet. Her shoulders were still tight, as though she expected the door to open and someone to tell her she'd made a mistake in stepping inside. He poured the coffee, without comment, the dark liquid glugging into a tin mug, and slid it across the table. She looked at it for a moment before wrapping both hands around the metal, as if the warmth might soak through skin and bone. He returned to the stove, crouching to feed it another split log, the fire answering with a low, hungry crackle. No questions passed between them, no names offered, only the quiet rhythm of him tending the heat and her sipping slowly, each swallow making her shoulders ease a fraction. When she set the mug down, he noticed the way her skirt rode up enough to show the crude strip of cloth tied around her ankle. It was stained with blood, stiff with dirt. Without a word, he took a small tin of salve from the shelf, knelt in front of her, and began to untie the knot. She stiffened, her eyes narrowing, but didn't pull back. The cloth peeled away, revealing an angry swell of skin and a cut that had not been well treated. He cleaned it with water from a basin, his hand steady and sure, then smeared the salve before winding a fresh bandage snug around the joint. She watched him the whole time, suspicion flickering and then fading into something she didn't seem to recognize. When it was done, he stood and set the basin aside. She murmured something under her breath, perhaps thanks, perhaps nothing at all, and he nodded once, as if to say it was settled. That night, he laid extra blankets on the bed in the corner, the one his late wife had kept neatly folded even on the coldest nights. She didn't question it, only sank into the mattress with a sigh that seemed to come from further back than the day itself. In the quiet before sleep claimed her, a piece of her memory stirred uninvited. The clang of picks and rock, the thick stink of unwashed bodies in a mining camp, a man's voice calling her name with a note that promised nothing good. She remembered clutching the bag, climbing into a freight car, and the long, bone-rattling ride towards somewhere she thought might be better. But the train had brought her here instead, to a station where nobody wanted her. Nobody except, perhaps, the man in the worn military coat. Morning came gray and slow. She found him outside splitting wood, the sound of the axe carrying through the frost. A knock on the door startled her, and when she opened it, a man from the nearest homestead stood there with a string of venison over his shoulder. He handed it to her with a quick glance past her shoulder, taking in the inside of the cabin. His smile was polite, but curiosity lingered in his eyes. By the time the man left, she knew the story of her presence would already be moving through the town like smoke. At the general store later that day, the whispers were thin but sharp. A woman near the counter murmured, "She's astray," while the man behind her muttered, "He's lost his mind," bringing her in. She pretended not to hear, but their voices clung to her all the way back through the snow. He didn't mention any of it. When they returned, he went about stacking the venison in the cold box and sharpening his knife. But the weight of what she'd heard sat heavy in her chest. That night, after he'd gone quiet in the chair by the stove, she gathered her bag, stuffing her few possessions inside with quick, quiet hands. She eased toward the door, the boards under her feet groaning softly. The fire popped, and she froze. He was still in the chair, his eyes open, the light from the stove casting their grayness in bronze. He didn't move, didn't reach for her, only said, "You'll freeze out there." The words were plain, without judgment or pleading. She stood in the half-light for a long moment, her fingers gripping the strap of her bag before setting it back down. She closed the door, moved to the chair opposite him, and sat without speaking. The firelight caught in the folds of her skirt, and the night went on. The first warning came as a shift in the air, hoofbeats carrying hard over packed snow, the sound cutting through the muffled quiet of midday. She was shelling beans at the table when she saw him through the narrow window, tall in the saddle, a long coat flapping, the shape of a man who carried trouble in his spine. The closer he came, the clearer his face, mean eyes, a jaw lined with a pale scar that tugged when he spoke. He rode straight into town and began asking. At the saloon, at the store. "A fat woman with a bad ankle," he said, as though the words themselves were property he claimed. The answers came easy. People here like to talk. By the time he reached the far end of the street, he knew exactly where to go. She heard the pounding before the shadow fell across the door. Her hands froze mid-motion, beans slipping to the floor. The knock came again, harder this time. She backed into the corner, her breath shallow, eyes fixed on the door like it might burst inward at any second. The widower stepped into view, calm as if it were just another caller. He opened the door enough to fill the frame with his body, the cold wind spilling around him. The man outside smiled without warmth. "I'm here for what's mine." "Ain't no one here for you," the widower said. His voice was even, the words carried without force, but they didn't waver. The stranger shifted in the snow, his lip curling. "Don't play righteous with me. She belongs." He tried to push past, but met the wall of the widower's chest. In one clean motion, the older man shoved him back hard enough that his boots slipped on the ice, sending him stumbling into the drift. They stood there in the brittle air, two men measuring the other in silence. No hands went to weapons, no shouting, just the wind between them, the creak of leather as the stranger righted himself, the quiet certainty in the way the widower didn't move from the doorway. A long beat passed. The stranger's eyes narrowed, then broke away. He spat into the snow, the dark stain steaming in the cold, and swung into the saddle without another word. The horse's hooves cracked the ice as they carried him down the trail, his figure shrinking until it was swallowed by the white horizon. When the door shut, the cabin felt warmer than it had all winter. She stood by the table, hands clasped tight, the question already in her face before she spoke it. "Why?" He hung his coat on the peg, his movements slow and deliberate. "Ain't about trouble," he said finally. "It's about a roof staying warm." Something in her shoulders softened then, though she didn't smile. The fire popped in the stove, filling the silence between them. Outside, the snow kept falling in patient, steady veils. Days later, the town had settled back into its rhythms, but folks noticed a chimney out at the edge of the ridge. Each night smoke rose against the dark, steady and sure. Those who passed by could see the faint glow through the frosted window. Two figures sitting close to the stove, one leaning forward, the other tilted back in the chair, the shapes caught in the flicker of the flames. On the cabin door, fresh marks gleamed in the grain where a knife had carved them deep. Two initials side by side, cut clean and true. The snow fell on without pause, covering the road, the ridge, the last faint trace of boot prints. The wind shifted and moved on, leaving the cabin in its quiet pool of light.